Well, today we actually come to the end, sadly,
Very sad.
of our journey, the lessons of the wilderness. I confess that I have mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, sadness that this will be my last Sunday for a while, but also a deep sense of gratitude for everything that we've learned here together, for the conversations that we've had and the lessons that we've learned. This is all new material for me, so every Sunday I've been learning something new, and I hope you feel like that as well. We conclude today with the last book of the Bible, the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation. And the account in Revelation chapter 12 of a woman who is pursued by a great dragon, and who flees into the wilderness where she finds refuge. The Apocalypse, of course, is a book of bizarre symbols and images, difficult to understand. Martin Luther, back in 1522, in the introduction to his translation of the Bible, the Luther Bible, Luther said, "No one knows what this book means." And then he continued, he was fond of beer, and Luther continued with a brewery metaphor. He said, many people have brewed into this book crazy ideas out of their own heads. And finally, Luther concluded, there are many better books for us to read. But I have to disagree with the great Martin Luther. I think that this is a profound book of extraordinary beauty and vision. There's a reason why the language of the Apocalypse saturates our liturgy, our worship today. The great Hallelujah chorus, Hallelujah, the Lord God omnipotent what? Reigneth. King of kings and Lord of lords. That's all straight from the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse. But it is a symbol, it is a book of symbols, wild symbols. The great whore riding through the desert, mounted on a beast, dressed in scarlet, and drinking out of a silver cup that is filled with what? The blood. The blood of the martyrs. The beast of the Apocalypse with 7 heads and 10 horns. The Lamb that was slain. And finally, of course, that mysterious number, 666, right? Now, some of the mysteries of the Apocalypse can be explained by knowledge of the time period when it was written, knowledge of the history of religion. But that doesn't necessarily turn out to be the key to the meaning of the book. That is to say, what does it mean for us today? That's more difficult. The book of Revelation invites, in fact, it requires the reader to find out the meaning for today, perhaps more than any book in the New Testament, there is an explicit invitation to decode the text. But that's tricky. And down through the years, people have gone astray. They have made all kinds of mistakes, I think. For example, Luther decided that the Antichrist in the book of Revelation, the beast, was who? The Pope. And Catholic interpreters who wrote in response to Luther decided that the Antichrist, the beast, was who?
Luther.
Martin Luther, of course. When Diane and I lived in Chicago when I was a student at the University of Chicago, we finally purchased a little condominium right by the lake. And in order to get home from the university, I had to walk underneath the railroad tracks every day. So I did that one day, and a figure stepped out of the shadows with a little pamphlet in his hand and gave it to me. And as I walked along, I read it, and the pamphlet explained that the number 666, if you assign a letter value to the numbers, spells out the name William Jefferson Clinton. Well, I don't know how you feel about that.
Larry, they also spelled it out as Kissinger.
Oh, yes, that's right. That's right. And Michael, if we think in terms of ancient languages, right, instead of modern English, the number 666 spells out Nero Caesar, which is probably what the author intended, rather than Saddam Hussein or Bill Clinton. So, how can we avoid the strange ideas that Luther rightly said many people have brewed into this book? How can we interpret the book authentically for our own time? And I think progress begins with recognition that the book is meant to be understood as an allegory. What is an allegory? Anybody? An allegory is something that has a meaning at what? Two levels, right? There is the level of the text with its narrative and its images, and then there is a higher, spiritual, existential meaning. But we don't teach allegorical interpretation in the graduate school or in the theological seminary. We teach philology and history, something called historical criticism. The allegorical method is difficult to control. So what we need is a basis. We need a floor, a foundation to keep our allegories from becoming fantasies. And in fact, the author has given us that. The author of the Apocalypse has told us what we need in order to interpret this book meaningfully. It's right at the beginning. Apocalypse chapter 1, verse 7. If you have it, you might want to look at it with me. The author says, I, John, your brother, who shares with you, it's actually verse 9, chapter 1, verse 9. I, John, your brother, who is a partner or who shares with you in 3 experiences: the affliction, the kingdom, and the endurance. So the three words are thlipsis, basileia, and hupomone. That last word, hupomone, is ordinarily translated in English Bibles patient endurance. But something more active, I'm convinced, is understood by the author, or is intended by the author of the Apocalypse. Hupomone not only means standing under, it means standing up against. And as you read the Apocalypse, you find out that the author encourages his readers to boycott the meat market and to refuse to trade with Roman coins bearing the image of the Caesar. So instead of endurance, I would translate that word hupomone, resistance. Does that make sense? The affliction, the kingdom, and the endurance. There is a South African interpreter of the Bible, a theologian named Alan Bosak. He was one of the authors of the Kairos document, was part of the struggle against apartheid. Now he is a faculty member at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis. That's where he wound up. But his best book, I think, is a little book on the Apocalypse, on the book of Revelation. It is entitled Comfort and Protest, the Power of the Apocalypse. And he's the one that called my attention to this verse right at the beginning. He's the one who insists that if we are John's partners, if we are his brothers in those three experiences, if you sometimes feel afflicted by the world that we are living in, right? And if you still feel the claim of God's kingdom upon your life, and if you find yourself pushing back, right? If you find yourself resisting, then you are able to understand this book, to apply it in the way that the author intended. Let me give an example of how that might work. Alan Bosak, who wrote his little book, Comfort and Protest, before the apartheid government in South Africa came to an end, Alan Bosak says, listen to this. He's commenting on the beast of the apocalypse. And he says, any government that would oblige its little children to look for their breakfast in the garbage heaps of a place like Soweto is the beast of the apocalypse, right? Now, you see, I think that is an authentic allegorical interpretation. It's not a wild fantasy. It's an interpretation that is in keeping with the method of the book. Now, with that in mind, I would like to turn to the 12th chapter. The picture of a woman who is pursued by a dragon. The woman is pregnant and she is about to give birth. And the dragon stands immediately in front of her, waiting for her to give birth, because he plans to what? Devour her child. But she is protected by God in the wilderness. The child is caught up to heaven. The dragon pursues the woman And again, she flees into the wilderness. And the dragon attempts to drown her with a huge stream of water that he vomits out of his mouth. But God causes the earth to open up and swallow the water. Now, the historical background, the background of this story in the history of religions could well be, as my former colleague, Adela Collins, I may have used the wrong marker, that's not erasing. I don't know why that was up here. As my former colleague, Adela Collins, has argued in her books on the apocalypse, she points out that the myth of a woman who gives birth and whose child is sought by a malignant demon, that myth was widespread in the ancient world. The version of it that she finds most relevant is the story of Leto and the python and Leto's son Apollo. Do you all know that story? It was very well known in the ancient world, very well known in Asia Minor, that is Turkey. John sent his book, The Apocalypse, to 7 churches that were located where?
Turkey.
In Turkey. And so the story goes like this. Zeus, the king of the gods, the father of the gods, fell in love, as he often did, with a mortal woman named Leto. And he had intercourse with her, and the wife of Zeus, Hera, found out about it. And she summoned a great dragon, a serpent named Python, who in the ancient myths is described more as a dragon than a snake. And Hera sent the Python to destroy the children of Leto. But Zeus called on his brother Poseidon to hide Leto, and he took her off to a deserted island, Delos. And there she gave birth to whom? Apollo and Artemis. The Greek version of Diane's name is Artemis. That's what my boys call her. Artemis. Well, Apollo hunted down the python. The python, in anger and frustration over not being able to find Leto and her children, the python had taken up residence on Mount Parnassus. Does anyone know where that is? What's located there today? Delphi. The great shrine of Delphi is on the side of Parnassus. And that's where the python was hiding. Apollo followed him there and shot the python with his arrows. He then cut up the body and put the bones in a big chest underneath a cave, which is where the oracle eventually developed. The Delphic oracle was in that cave that contained the bones of the python. That's why the woman who gave oracular prophecies is called what? The Pythia, right? The Pythia, because of that snake, that dragon, the python. Now, there are other versions of a story like this. A woman and a child, a monster, a dragon. There are Egyptian versions. There are Iranian versions. And so that widespread story is probably in the background of chapter 12 of the book of Revelation. Okay, before you and I try to elicit the lesson of the wilderness, I'd like to go through the text verse by verse and look at the images and try to figure out what's going on. The story actually begins in the last verse of chapter 11. Chapter 11, verse 19 says, "Then the temple of God in heaven opened, and the ark of his covenant was seen in his temple. And there were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail." If you're reading that verse in Greek, you can see clearly that the doors of the temple swing open by themselves. There's no mention of temple attendants opening the doors. And in the ancient world, when the doors of a temple opened by themselves, that was the sign of a prodigy. Something momentous is about to happen.
Like the curtains torn in two.
Exactly. In the poet Virgil's master work, the Aeneid, when Aeneas comes to Italy seeking to know where he should settle his people, where he can create a future, the doors of the temple at Cumae swing open by themselves. Now, the Ark of the Covenant, that's what John sees when the doors of heaven open. By the 1st century AD, when John is writing this book, where was the Ark of the Covenant? Gone. It had been gone from the temple for 400 years. Since the time of the Babylonian captivity. You know that movie that Harrison Ford made called what? Raiders of the Lost. The Lost Ark. The Ark had been lost for a long time. The Temple of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus had no Ark of the Covenant. 1st century writers speculated about what had happened to it. Some people, the Samaritans, thought that it had been buried somewhere on Mount Gerizim. Egyptian Jews argued that it had been buried somewhere down in Egypt. But the fact is that it was lost. Now, what did the ark mean for the people of Israel? The ark was the embodiment of what?
It held the 10 Commandments, the stone.
It did. It held the 10 Commandments. On top of it was something called what? The mercy seat. The ark was the reminder, it was the embodiment of what? God's presence. Thank you. You get an A+ for today. It was the divine presence that the ark signified, and that's why the loss of it was so terrible for the Jewish people. The loss of the ark is lamented by Jewish writers in this period. There's a book called 4th Ezra, and at the center of that text is deep grief over the plundering of the ark by the enemies of God, the loss of it. The fact that there is no longer an ark of God in the temple. So, do you see what John is saying? John is saying that the ark is not lost. The divine presence is what? In heaven. And when the doors of that temple swing open, there is access to it. You can see it. God is still with us. That's the message that the author puts in the frame around this story. It's a message about the persistence of the divine presence, that God is still with us. And all of those atmospheric events, right? The lightning, the thunder. In the Bible, those things are signs of a theophany. What's a theophany? The appearance or the manifestation of God. When Moses goes up on Mount Sinai to receive the Ten Commandments, the Israelites are frightened because they can hear thunder and they can see lightning. Those meteoric events in the Old Testament are the sign of God's presence and God's manifestation. Next verse, chapter 12, verse 1. And a great Simeon. That's the Greek word for sign. A great Simeon was seen in the heaven. Now, that Greek word, Simeon, can mean three things, at least. First of all, the mundane level, it is a mark by which something is recognized or identified. Secondly, it is an omen, an indication of something that is about to come. That's why most English versions translate it here as portent. And finally, Simeon was frequently used in the ancient world to describe a constellation, an arrangement of stars. I think all of those meanings are operating here in the text. A Simeon appears in the heaven, and here is what the Simeon is. It is a woman. Now look at how she is described. Clothed with the sun, and the moon beneath her feet, and upon her head was a crown of 12 stars, the zodiac. Now what we're given here is a picture of a woman as the queen of the cosmos. Archaeologists have discovered that Artemis is depicted in this way. I'm going to tell our sons that. On gems, archaeologists excavating in Turkey have found gems that depict Artemis clothed with the sun, standing on the moon, with stars up on her head. Now, I suppose that's where John got the imagery. But what about the meaning, the interpretation of this woman? In the history of Christian interpretation of this book, the earliest interpreters say that the woman is who? Remember, she's about to give birth to a male child who will rule the nations with a rod of iron. Yes, Mary. Another A+ for today. The earliest interpreters take this to be Mary. But as we will see, there is a good deal in the text as it unfolds which suggest that she is actually the church, the followers of Jesus. Or you could think of her even more broadly as the people of God throughout history. The Jewish people, the followers of Jesus, the people of God at any time and place who are persecuted by diabolic forces. Verse 2, she was pregnant and she cried out in labor in the throes of childbirth. Isaiah chapter 66 verse 7 contains the metaphor of the people of Israel as a woman who is about to give birth to a male child. And her labor pains are the signs, according to Isaiah, that salvation is coming. Similarly, in Isaiah chapter 26, verse 17, the people of Israel are compared to a helpless woman in front of her enemies, a woman with child who, quote, writhes and cries out in her pains when her time is near. And there is a lengthy text from the Dead Sea Scrolls which pictures this woman in travail and eventually bringing forth, quote, a marvelous, mighty counselor. So the image was around in the time of John. Verse 3, then another sign, Simeon once again, was seen in the heaven. And behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns or diadems upon his heads. Now, the word drakon, can you say that with me? Drakon, in Jewish literature of the period, is one of the designations of Satan, the adversary of God. Drakon is also used 4 times in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, to describe Leviathan, that sea monster that symbolizes chaos. Draco was also the name of a constellation in the ancient world, the dragon up in the sky. And what about the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns? Well, elsewhere in the Apocalypse, namely chapter 17, the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns clearly signifies the Roman Empire and Roman emperors. The diadems, of course, signify kingship. Chapter 12, verse 4. And the dragon's tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them down to earth. There is a story in an ancient Jewish text that didn't quite make it into the Bible, but it was very popular at this time, called First Enoch. Have you heard of it? And First Enoch fully develops the story of a group of bad or evil angels called the Watchers. They are watching over human activity. And like the stars in the book of Revelation, the Watchers are angels that are swept down to earth in order to do the devil's bidding.
Trolls.
Now,
Trolls.
yes, trolls. Now, I want to stop.
Cyber trolls.
Cyber trolls. That's a good application. I want to stop just at this point and observe that the action of Revelation 12 takes place on many levels. We're about to move down to the earth, where the woman is confronted by the dragon. But the semea, the signs that John sees, are said to be where? In heaven. Now, that's an important insight. John wants to tell us that our experience, the experience of affliction, the experience of God's kingdom, and of our endurance or resistance, takes place on many levels. It takes place on a level above us that transcends us. Things that we can't get a hold of or grasp. Things that have not happened yet because they're in the future. But it also takes place here and now on this earth. And in the Apocalypse, we are encouraged to understand ourselves as part of this cosmic drama of God and human beings.
Larry,
Yes?
are there any literary connections to Jesus's great empathy back at the beginning of your series?
Yes. In fact, we are about to see a specific connection. The devil, the great Drakon, is about to be cast down from heaven. And as he falls, he sweeps a third of the stars down. And most commentators believe that the clearest and closest parallel to this is found in Luke, the Gospel of Luke, at that moment when the 70 disciples, in Luke it's not just 12, 70 are sent out to spread the work of Jesus, the work of compassion, of empathy, of responding to people who are suffering from diseases and who are oppressed by demons. And do you remember what happens? After a while of engaging in the work of Jesus, the 70 come back and report breathlessly and so excited to Jesus about the way that people have responded to them and the good they've been able to do. And do you remember what Jesus says? It's the only place in the Gospels where Jesus reports on a vision that he himself had, like the Apocalypse. The Gospel of Luke says that when Jesus heard the report about the success of the empathetic ministry of the 70, Jesus said, listen to this, he said, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. So the spread of the work of Jesus is interpreted as what? Victory over Satan. I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven, Jesus says. And that's probably the closest parallel that we have to what's being described here in the text. Chapter 12, verse 4. And the dragon stood before the woman. Now we're down on earth. Who is about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might swallow the child. There are lots of myths in the ancient world that portray a scene like this. Do we have here any readers of Hesiod? Hesiod's Theogony? You remember that before Zeus, the father of the gods was named Kronos, and he was married to Rhea. And she would give birth to children, and Kronos would do what? Eat them up.
Terrible guy.
And finally, she gives birth to Zeus. But instead of giving Kronos Zeus to eat, she gives him what? A stone. And he eats the stone and dies. Zeus is hidden away on Crete. Chapter 12, verse 5. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who will shepherd all the nations with a rod of iron. There is a clear allusion here to Psalm chapter 2, verse 9, where it is said that the one who will shepherd all the nations with a staff or crook of iron is who? The anointed one. What's the Hebrew word for anointed? Messiah. Messiah. So John makes it clear that this child that is about to be born is Jesus, is the Messiah. But the child was caught up. He was not eaten. He was caught up to God and to God's throne. Most interpreters think that this is an allusion to the ascension of Jesus, or to the enthronement of Jesus at the right hand of God. But many Greek myths at the time speak of the children of God's being seized by their parents and taken up to heaven. So Dionysus is saved by his father Zeus. Hercules is taken up to heaven by Zeus. Chapter 12, verse 6. Now we come to the point of this story for us. And the woman fled Ace Tain Eramon into the what? Wilderness. Where she had a place prepared there for her by God, that she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Now, what we are forcefully reminded of here is that the wilderness was, in the biblical tradition, and can still be for us today, a place of refuge, a place of salvation. It was for the Dead Sea Scrolls community when those ancient members of the covenant had a falling out with the high priest in Jerusalem. They withdrew into a community at the northwest edge of the Dead Sea. And in their writings, you can see that they regarded their location in the wilderness as a place of refuge where they could prepare themselves spiritually for what was coming. They thought what was coming was a final battle between good and evil. But they're not the only ones. In Jewish history, do you remember the Maccabees? Judas Maccabee and his sons who refused to worship the statue of the Greek king in the temple, Antiochus Epiphanes. That's the event that is celebrated today by Jews in December called what? Hanukkah. Yeah, it's the origin of Hanukkah. And how did Judas Maccabeus and his boys escape from the wrath of Antiochus Epiphanes? They fled into the wilderness. And there they found refuge. And they prepared themselves to come back and restore the temple of God. Chapter 12, verse 7. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back. Among the literature found at the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is a scroll that describes Melchizedek, who is apparently identified with Michael, the archangel. And in that scroll, Melchizedek fights together with God's angels and vanquishes Beliar and his evil spirits. Verse 8. And he, that is the dragon, was not strong enough to prevail, nor was there a place found for him any longer in heaven. Now that Greek word that is translated not strong enough, iskuein. Can you say that with me? Iskuein. It is the Greek translation of the Latin word imperium habera, to have power, to have rule, to exercise imperium. It's the power that was possessed by whom? Roman generals and eventually the emperor, right? So some scholars have suggested that when the author of the Apocalypse says that the devil did not have enough what? Imperium.
Political power.
Yes, that there is a critique here of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire will not prove strong enough to prevail over the people of God. Verse 9, and the great dragon was cast down, the ancient serpent, the one called the devil and Satan, the one who leads the whole inhabited earth astray. Look how John here piles up, right, the names for the evil power in the world. John is clearly tempting, he is attempting, trying to expose the real force of the antagonist of God throughout cosmic and human history. And it is here, I think, Chuck, that we have the connection to Jesus' vision. I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Why? Because the followers of Jesus, responding to the needs of the sick and the poor, were driving him out. Verse 9, and he was cast down to the earth, and his angels were cast down with him. It is the same in 1 Enoch. The devil's angels are come down to earth. They're called the Watchers, and they try to interfere with human life. In the book of Jude, the Epistle of Jude, verse 6, it says, and the angels did not keep their own positions, but they left their proper dwelling. And so they have been put by God into eternal chains in the nether gloom until the great day of judgment that is coming. Verse 10, we're almost finished. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now has occurred the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority, the exousia of His Messiah. The story stops for a minute, and the author inserts a hymn. He inserts a hymnic commentary on the meaning of Satan's expulsion. What it means, he says, is nothing less than the victory of God and God's Messiah. By the way, this is the only place in the book of Revelation that speaks of the exousia, the authority of the Messiah. And once again, scholars have noticed that the Greek word exousia is frequently used as a translation of the Latin imperium. And so once again, scholars suggest that John is being critical of the supreme power that was asserted by Roman generals and by the emperors. And why should we now celebrate a victory? Because, John says, the accuser, the kategor of our brothers and sisters has been cast out. The one who accused us before God day and night. The Greek word kategor is a literal translation of the Hebrew what? Satan. Satan means accuser. And in ancient Jewish literature, the role of Satan was to accuse and prosecute the people of God. That's the way it's found in the book of Job. That's the way it's found in the book of Zechariah. So you get the message? The one who is constantly attacking us before God, accusing us, prosecuting us, has been cast out of God's presence and can't any longer slander us in that way. And now the end of the hymn, and they, that is the people of God, conquered him through what? The blood of the Lamb, and through the word of their martyria, their testimony to the point of death. For, the author says, they had learned not to love their own lives to the point of death. We will come back to that. First, let's finish the story. Therefore rejoice, O heaven, and those who dwell therein. Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil is now very what? Angry. The Greek word is orge. He's very angry. And he has been cast down to you. And he is angry because he knows that his time is what? Short. And when the dragon saw that he had been cast down to earth, he pursued the woman who had delivered the child. But there were given to the woman 2 wings of a large eagle. In Exodus chapter 19, verse 4, God says, "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you up on" what? Eagle's wings. "And brought you to myself." The text continues. She's given the eagle's wings so that she can fly to her place in the wilderness, where she will be taken care of. The text says, nurtured for a time, times, and half a time. 1,260 days. And she will be protected from the presence of the serpent. Now here the message becomes pretty clear, doesn't it? The desert, the wilderness, is a place of refuge. We have to remind ourselves that when the Israelites were pursued by Pharaoh and his horsemen and chariots, they were saved by going where? Into the wilderness. David, when he was being hunted by the angry king Saul, escaped from him twice, found refuge in the wilderness. Elijah the prophet, when he was being persecuted by the followers of Baal, twice found refuge in the wilderness. And then there is the story of what happened to the Jerusalem church, the followers of Jesus in Jerusalem. According to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 13, Jesus warned the disciples that when they saw the day of judgment approaching, they should what? Flee into the wilderness. Now, the great church historian Eusebius, who lived in the 4th century, in his Ecclesiastical History, Book 3, tells us that when the Roman army approached Jerusalem, but before they laid siege to it, the followers of Jesus remembered what he had told them. When you see the day approaching, do what? Flee into the wilderness. And so, according to Eusebius, the followers of Jesus fled over the Jordan River into a little wilderness town called Pella. Have you all heard about this? Pella in Jordan. For a long time, Chuck, scholars thought that this was just a legend to explain the disappearance of the Jerusalem church after 70. But then a few years ago, guess what the archaeologists found in Jordan? They found hundreds of ancient Christian texts. Unfortunately, they have been what? Burned, carbonized, so that it's going to take years and a lot of scientific advances to unroll them and read them. But we know, because of this discovery, that Christians did flee to Jordan and lived there for quite a while. Finally, and the serpent, who is after the woman, spewed water like a river from his mouth behind the woman. It's impossible to read that without thinking about our recent hurricanes, right? And he was attempting to wash her away. Rivers and floods are frequently agents of destruction in ancient literature. Verse 16, and the earth helped the woman. The earth opened up its mouth and swallowed the river which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. And finally, the last verse, verse 17. And the dragon was angry because of the woman, and he left to wage war upon the rest of her children. Now, in general, I think there are 3 lessons of the wilderness from this amazing chapter right at the center of the apocalypse. I'm going to say what those 3 lessons are and then invite you to take the next step, the step of making the application to our moment, our time and place. Here, I think, are the 3 lessons, and they are very obvious. They're simple and basic. They're not intellectually difficult, but they are morally difficult. Do we have the faith and the courage to believe them? The first lesson: the wilderness is and can be a place of what? Refuge. That's right. And that has taught me something as I've thought about it this past week. Now, like you, I feel like we're in the wilderness now in a lot of ways. And because I'm a type A personality and I worry so much, as my wife knows, my immediate response is frenetic action or more worry. But this text reminds me that the wilderness is a place of refuge. It's a place to be safe and to prepare. Secondly, the message of this text is clearly that God has already won the war. That hymn right at the middle of the chapter that interrupts the story celebrates the salvation, the victory, the deliverance that God has already won. Now, the lesson for me anyway, the challenge is, can I believe that? Can I hold on to that? Jesus believed it. Jesus believed one thing above all, that God reigns. The kingdom of God was his one great idea. So the author of this text tells us that we may not be able to see it. It may be too big for us to take it in. Or it may show itself only in the future. But the ark of God's presence is what? Still with us. Still accessible. And The victory has already been won. Can we believe it? Can we move on in that assurance? But then the third lesson, which is also very difficult, we will continue to be pursued by who? The dragon, the devil. Even after the woman is saved, the devil is angry and he goes off to wage war upon the rest of her children. Right? Well, those are the three difficult lessons of this text. Important lessons for us. Our wilderness moment could be, if we were able to claim it, it could be a time of refuge for us. And then we need to know that God is the one who ultimately rules. God has the victory. And maybe if we hang on to that, we can continue to resist the onslaughts of the devil. Okay. What do you think? Contemporary applications. Can you relate this text more directly to our moment and experience? You want some time to think about it? Yes, Chuck.
So the message to me is a message that sort of underscores the contestation of authority and of the
Good.
church.
Good.
You know, we have, you know, Christianity is split. We're not together. You know, we've got conservatism, fundamentalism that puts authority in a single God, in one person. You know, the divinity of nation. You know, of the nation head, the head of the nation, and then we've got progressive Christianity that sees authority in us, and the way we look at authority and the way we work together and collaborate. If we don't talk about the progressive side on a regular basis, the other side just continues to beat the hell out of us.
You're making an important point that I should have brought out more clearly in this text. The woman is pregnant and gives birth to what? A son. But we find out later that the woman has what? Many children. Other sons and daughters. And to them, the text says, is given exousia.
Authority.
So
the authority of the community.
The authority
of a single person.
The authority of the community. And I think the woman herself, right? She and her children, her many sons and daughters, represent the people of God trying, in whatever time and place, to outlive affliction, to answer the call of God's kingdom, and to resist. So I think that's right. Yes?
Larry, you gave us three things we learned. I'd like to restate them quite differently. One is, I really think that the wilderness, as you said, was correct, but it's a place for thoughtfulness and reflection.
Good.
And so it teaches us that the way forward is through thoughtfulness and reflection.
Right. You're exactly right. That's brought out in the text. Again, I should have made it more clear. When the woman is in the wilderness, the text says that she is actually nurtured by God, right? So it's not just a place of refuge. There's some reflection, some preparation, some nurture going on there.
Or mindfulness. Secondly, I really like the second part, not only in which I see it more as hope. God has won. Never abandon hope.
Right.
And finally, the third
Right.
tells us to be vigilant, especially vigilant because we are always pushed to lose our empathy. And so the three I had was thoughtfulness, hope, and vigilance to maintain our empathy.
That's excellent. If you don't mind, I'm going to take that down.
Well, you may certainly take it down. You're much smarter.
No, that's excellent. Thank you. Michael?
I've also reflect on history. You know, we've had, over the past century, we have had 3 epic struggles with ideologies that you could safely say are evil. Fascism, Nazism, the whole thing we had in World War II, and also after that, communism. In each case, there was a time where the victory was achieved, but the war wasn't over.
Right.
You know, we fought the Japanese, we fought them for the first 6 months, we were losing, we win at the Battle of Midway. It's another 3 years before the war is over, but we never lost another battle. In Europe, it was Stalingrad, it was the invasion in Normandy. There was still a lot of fighting, but the other side never won a battle again. Communism, we were struggling with that throughout. We have the victory when Eastern Europe falls away and returns and the communism is overthrown. We still have this rump evil empire that's now a corrupt mafia, but we've won.
Yeah.
And we're still fighting the battle. So that kind of idea that we win, but we have to keep on struggling.
Right.
But we don't lose hope because we have won.
Right. And as you say, we remain vigilant.
One of the issues that you didn't bring up, Michael, was terrorism, which is the fourth. And in terrorism, I would say the same thing occurs. You should, in fact, be thoughtful about it. You should be hopeful. And you should, of course, be vigilant with empathy.
Right. Right.
And even
Yes.
terrorism is something where if they can't win with terror, they can merely scare us. They only win when we give up.
Right. Yes.
I think the really important point right now is that those threats are not only external, but they are internal.
Yes.
And we must look at ourselves and look at our own community and be vigilant.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That brings us, I think, back to a point in the text where the author says that the people of God who won the victory were those who had learned not to love their own lives so much. You remember Jesus said, the person who wants to save himself, who cares too much about his own life, is going to lose what? His soul. But the one who loves something higher, God's kingdom, will save his soul. Yes?
Just to boil it really down to a nutshell for me, for this parish, for our time of transition, I've not loved the term wilderness. It seems very negative. So I like the hope that Lonnie brings and how he stated that. The wilderness is sometimes necessary and is a place for us to learn and to grow and to have that hope. And I'd like to lose all the language about wars and battles and who got the victory and who did, because I'm all done with that. I've been done with that for a long time. But let's think about the wilderness as a place that we can come out of in a positive way and not think of the wilderness in a negative concept.
That is a very good last word. And can I tell you all that that's what I see happening here. In the past weeks, as I have been with you, I'm seeing a people of God who are coming through this wilderness period with actually a renewed sense of commitment to this ministry and a renewed hope and perseverance. So I think that's exactly the right place to stop. Thank you all so much.
Yeah.
Thank you for those comments.